So all it remains for me to say is thank you to Owen and James for joining us. Owen and James are going to be talking to us about, obviously, the Infuse programme, the methods and mindsets needed for data innovation, the lessons learned from implementing the Infuse programme across the Cardiff Capital region, and how the approach might be taken forward in the future. So, Owen, it's over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne. Prynawn da pawb. Good afternoon, everyone. As soon as Suzanne mentioned, my role has been to lead the Infuse programme. And what I would like to do is to offer you perhaps some context, the what, the where, the why, and a little bit of the how, before I hand over to the real star of the show, Professor James Lewis, who we like to refer to as our chief geek. So what James will bring is that data expertise that you can expect. But I just wanted to start with Infuse, and I'm going to share some slides with you if that's okay. So Infuse is a programme. For the past 3 years, we've been supported by the European Social Fund, and we've been working in partnership with EURLab, Cardiff University, with Nesta, an innovation foundation, the Cardiff Capital Region, and 10 local authorities which sit across South East Wales. Our focus has been on building the skills, the capacity, and one to add, the confidence for innovation across the public sector. What we've been doing is bringing some of the sharpest minds from public service into a knowledge exchange, or I suppose collision space, with academia and innovation specialists from Nesta. It's been a perfect kind of balance, if you like, of high challenge and high support. The programme, we tend to work with around 35 existing or aspiring public or third sector leaders. We take them through a process of 6 months. And perhaps I'll show you what that process looks like. So this is the Infuse innovation process, and the 6 months that I alluded to just now. So what we do within that explore phase is focus on the skills, the tools, the methods, and importantly, the mindsets for innovation. Innovation within public service can be a huge challenge. Myself, I think probably around 25 years in public service, and I know firsthand how difficult that can be. Rules, risk, governance can dominate, where actually we need wide-scale change. So Infuse was set up to tackle societal challenges. So some of the big wicked issues that facing our communities, our organisations. And the important word for Infuse is collaboration. So instead of looking at them from an organisational or a geographical perspective, we've looked at them together. And I think that's hugely important. The magic is bringing those people together, certainly in that boot camp stage where we make them feel challenged, uncomfortable at times, but like I said, supported. So James is going to talk to you about Data Lab, so I will leave that one there. But we also complement the programme by strategic and sustainable procurement. And how can we unlock some of the potential that sits within public and third sector spending? Absolutely critical for Infuse as a programme is, whilst there is a huge amount of learning, everything is applied to the real world through innovation experiments. So they are collaborative, they aim to move a challenge or a problem forward, and we learn from them. Failure is not a problem. We create a safe space in which that we learn from failure as opposed to others. I will not dwell on this slide, but if you'd like to know a little bit more about what we've been doing, there are some kind of outputs and outcomes there. I think one just to highlight is, as a programme, we understand that for any data, digital, or maybe social innovation within organisations, buy-in from the very top level of those organisations, those hierarchies, is absolutely imperative. So every individual in the Infuse programme is paired up as a reverse mentor for their senior leader, so chief executive, board member, you know, high-ranking leadership roles within the organisation are actually mentored by individuals on the programme, bringing a very fresh perspective, a different feedback, and I suppose diffusing some of the key learning points from the programme into those organisations. I would just like you to dwell on this quote from Steve Jobs for 2 seconds and just ask yourself the question, those of you that work in organisations, in business, how many times have you seen innovation as a threat as opposed to an opportunity? How many times have you seen the risk ahead of the opportunity? This gives you an understanding. The last cohort that has been through the programme, just a very quick idea of some of the topics in which we are looking to make a difference. We have 2 key themes: building supported communities and accelerating decarbonisation. Those are the 2 things that matter to us, that we want to make a difference on as a programme. And there are the collaborative learning groups that have been through the programme. Experimentation, you know, and happy to chat this one through maybe in some questions, but experimentation, certainly in my experience of public service, is not widespread. Wales can be seen as the land of pilots, and then there's a valley of death for some of those pilots. And I think what in Infuse we've been able to prove is that experiments can build the knowledge, they can reduce the risk, they can stop things that don't work very, very quickly, and they offer us some direction and learning. So we are keen through Infuse to embed that experimentation mindset within the work and the support that we offer. After James is finished, I'll talk to you about one of the key outputs from the programme, and I'll also drop that into the chat function. It is the Infuse handbook. What we've done is try to distill all of the key learning points from the programme and put them into a very simple but effective format, which perhaps if I show you there, the text is quite small, so apologies for that. But this is something that I have no doubt James will talk about. Data action stories, a really, really important kind of hypothesis statement, if you like, 3 key questions. But this is the handbook in a nutshell. Introduction of a principle of which we've tested, we've broken, and perhaps we've refined. There is extra learning for those that are interested. Data action stories actually comes from Ben Proctor at Data Orchard, for those of you that work in this world. And what you can see are some examples of how our associates or alumni members have applied them to their own context. I'm going to stop there, Suzanne, and hand over to my colleague, James. But hopefully that gives you a quick understanding of what Infuse is, what we set out to achieve, and the format in which that, I suppose, Data Lab, of which Chief Geek will now run you through how it sits within our innovation programme. James, over to you.
Great, thanks a lot, Owen. Can I ask people, if they don't mind, to just type in the chat what they do and where they do it, please, just so we get a sense of who's on the call, who's interested in this topic area, so you can see a bit of who else is here as well as yourselves. If I could ask people to start doing that, that'd be great. And I'll just give a second for people to type some stuff into the chat, if that's all right. This is great. So I can see already we've got a great range of people here from different organisations. A few local authorities, a few other organisations. See Sam from Audit Wales is here. That's great. Hi, Sam. Yeah, great. Bunch of really interesting people we've got here. So hopefully, for some of you, this won't all be new by any stretch, but hopefully it'll be a little bit different to what you're used to, and hopefully it will provoke some helpful thinking for all of us. So in the data lab, we've distilled down 3 key messages, and that's been data enabled, creating the conditions, and using data with integrity. So I'll go into those in a bit more detail in a minute. If you could go next slide, please. Great. So the plan for today is I'll give you an update on our thinking on how public bodies can work better with data after running 4 consecutive cohorts of Infuse. So we had our cohort alpha, our test cohort, and then we had cohorts 1, 2, and 3. And across the 4 cohorts, we've had about 120 people, mostly local authority staff, but not exclusively. I'll provide you with some of the key tools we covered in the data lab, and I'll share some of the mindset shifts that we think are necessary going forward. So next slide, please. So the data lab team, it's not just me, there was 4 of us on the team. So Laura, who was the data lab program manager, made this slide, as you can probably guess quite quickly. So I was the strategic lead for the data lab, or chief nerd. Thanks, Laura. Laura was the actual chief nerd, which if anyone knows me and Laura knows it was Laura who was in charge, not me. Rob Callahan was the sensible one. So he was the research associate, and Liz Gallagher was the data scientist, aka the smart one. So I'd just like to acknowledge the work of all those people. So what did we learn that data innovation is not over 4 cohorts? Well, if you Google data innovation, you get graphics like this a lot. So we learned that data innovation is not moody backgrounds. It's not men in suits striding across, I don't know what that is, some kind of optical bridge while data flies between skyscrapers. It's not really like whiz-bang 3D graphic stuff. It's not, well, the bottom right one looks a bit like E.T. doing data innovation, if any of you are old enough to remember E.T. We learned that data innovation is not about any of this stuff. Next slide, please. So what did we learn? So we learned that we can equip public servants with the right tools, and we can help them to be confident in challenging the status quo. Sorry, I'm just getting over COVID, so if I cough a bit, I'm sorry. But fundamentally, organizations themselves must be willing to create and embed the conditions necessary for innovation to thrive. Otherwise, data projects just become much, much, much harder, become much more grind than they need to be. And those conditions don't arise just organically. You have to proactively create those conditions. Next slide. So many of you will have heard of Machiavelli's book, The Prince. So this was a book written about the dark arts of politics and diplomacy and this kind of thing in the early 16th century, hence the term Machiavellian for someone who's backstabbing. But here's a great quote from the book. There's nothing more difficult to plan, more doubtful of success, nor more dangerous to manage than the creation of a new order of things. Whenever his enemies have the ability to attack the innovator, they do so with a passion of partisans, while the others defend him sluggishly, so the innovator and his party alike are vulnerable. Now, I don't know about your organisation, but certainly working in Cardiff University, this feels quite familiar quite a lot of the time. It feels as relevant now as I'm sure it was 510 years ago. And so I invite you to consider if this feels familiar to you about your organisation, would you like to try doing a data project in these circumstances? It's quite difficult, right? So next slide, please. So we've distilled our thinking down to 3 key messages to help with this, this challenge. And these are the 3. So and I'm sorry, I don't know what's happening with the number in there. They're all equally important. That's why they're all number 1. That must be what it is. So The first one is public bodies seeking to innovate in the use of data should aim to be data enabled rather than data driven. I'll go into each of these in more detail on the next slide. So be data enabled, don't be data driven. The second is that public bodies need to proactively create the right conditions. And the third is that we believe using data with integrity increases public confidence and trust. Next slide. So taking data enabled first. You see lots of reports saying that local authorities, local government, public bodies should be data driven. And we think it's better to use the concept of being data enabled. So we think, and this is really, we were inspired in this by talking to Eddie Copeland, who runs the London Office of Technology and Innovation, and prior to that was at Nesta, and also Ben Proctor, who did work at Satori Lab and now works at Data Orchard. And they both really challenged and encouraged us to start data projects from the outcomes you're trying to achieve rather than from the data. So being data driven implies starting with the data, we feel, whereas being data enabled is about starting with the outcomes you want to achieve. Who do you want to be better off in what ways because you acted? We think being data enabled helps to avoid analysis paralysis, or those data trawling exercises many of you will be familiar with, that often starts with, well, I'm sure there's something useful in all that data we've got. Let's look for something useful. So we think starting with the outcomes helps avoid some of these problems. And then thirdly, the data are always a simplification of reality. We're all much more complex than the data anyone holds about us. And the data never tell you the full story. So we think it's better to be enabled by data as a useful tool in your arsenal rather than be driven by a partial picture. Next slide. So Ben Proctor introduced us to the idea of a data action story, and this has its roots in a couple of different things, including user stories, which is often used in user-centered design. And it takes the following pattern. If only we knew, given insight, we could take specific action so that we achieve certain outcomes. So certain people will be better off in whichever ways we hope for. So it goes insight to action to outcome. Next slide. And one reason, yeah, if you could go back one, sorry. Yeah, perfect. So one reason we think it's so important is this implies that lack of data is a barrier to achieving your outcomes. So lack of data is what's stopping you get from figuring out your insight to be able to take action. And we found that if people can't write a data action story, it's often because the real barrier is not a lack of data. The real barrier could be political will, or could be a lack of resources to do something, etc. So we found that requiring people to write a data action story really helps. So next slide, please. So let's say an example. Let's try and bring this to life a bit. So let's say the problem is, despite the energy price cap, there are many residents who face unaffordable fuel bills. This could drive them further into poverty and adversely affect their health. So a good data action story might go something like, if only we knew which households in our area are at highest risk of fuel poverty, we could target our collective services towards these households so we can make better use of our scarce resources to mitigate the worst impacts of fuel poverty on our most vulnerable residents. Now, so far so obvious, you might think. Next slide. Maybe you've been in a meeting about, take this as an example, where you're talking about fuel poverty and that we need to do something about fuel poverty. And someone, often the person chairing the meeting or the person in charge, says, I don't know what we're going to do about fuel poverty. Haven't we got lots of data on this? We need to look at the data. So next slide. So what happens then is 4 people leave the meeting and all go to their teams with slightly different versions of the same thing. So one goes to their team and says, can you tell me what's happening with fuel poverty? A second says, quick, I need all our data on fuel poverty. A third says, who's most at risk this winter, neglecting that this is around fuel poverty. And the fourth is, what data do we have on poverty, ignoring the fact that it's fuel poverty specifically. And you can imagine if you leave with these 4 different questions, you'll all get quite different answers. And then next slide. If you're the analyst in the team, you may be forgiven for saying something along the lines of, but we gave them these data last winter and they didn't do anything with it. So if you go to the next slide. So yeah, just really emphasizing that if you write a good data action story, it means that everyone's clear on why you're trying to do the analysis, which makes it much easier to do the right analysis. Yeah, so really helps that. And if you go to the next slide, one of our Infuse associates, who is a local authority data analyst, said that if every request for analysis had to include a data action story, I could do a better job and I'd find my work more satisfying. Now, before I continue, my grandmother always used to say to me, I don't know what you're talking about, James, because you're talking so fast, but I'm sure it's lovely, dear. Can I just check, am I talking at the right speed, too slow, too fast? Can you type in the chat whether it's too slow, too fast, or about right? All good? Okay, perfect, great. Thanks. So we use 2 tools to help people be data enabled in particular. One is the data action story, which is the simpler tool. And the second is this slightly more complex tool, which is, I mentioned Eddie Copeland from LOTI, the London Office of Technology and Innovation, and this is their 6-step data methodology. I won't go into this in detail because we devote a whole hour to this in the data lab. But we start with number 1, so with the outcomes. So which specific people do we want to be better off in which specific ways because we acted? Once you've figured that out, you go to step 2. Who could do what differently if they have better information? And a good question to ask here is, if we knew everything in the world, who would do what differently? Step 3 is, what would they need to see on a screen to enable those actions? Is it a heat map? Is it a prioritized list? Is it some insight around what's causing a given problem? What would you need to see on a screen to enable those actions? Number 4 is data then. What data are required to create those insights? And then 5 is ethics. Can we access and use data legally and ethically? And 6 is enablers. So beyond the data, what else would we need? So it could be changes to people, processes, ways of working, etc. 2 things to note. One is the data. This is the data methodology. Data only arrives in step 4. You first work out who you want to be better off in what ways because you acted, who needs to do what differently if they have better information, and what they need to see on a screen to enable those actions before you even start talking about data. So that's interesting. And then the other thing is, Eddie says the step that everyone tries to skip is step 2. And he's never seen a successful data project that skips step 2. Normally because people can't articulate who's going to do what differently because data is not really the barrier. It's not, the barrier is not better, you need better information. So he says if you skip step 2, he's never seen a successful data project that skips that. Next slide. So that was just to give you some sense of what we mean by being data enabled with data action stories and with the LOTI 6-step method. Now I'll talk briefly about proactively creating the right conditions for data innovation. Next slide. Great. So we think 2 things really help. One is a learning culture that prioritizes meaningful measurement. So not measurement just for measurement's sake or measurement for what are often called vanity metrics. They're just meant to make you look good, but really meaningful measurement that drives learning. And the second is really about understanding and seeking to improve data maturity. Next slide. So the Treasury Magenta book on evaluation talks about 2 reasons for evaluation. One is accountability and one is learning. We think that organizations often spend most of their time on measuring for accountability. So are you spending, and that's important, you know, it's important you spend You know whether you're spending public money correctly, whether you're doing what you said you were going to do, all these kind of things. So accountability bit is really important. But we think the learning bit gets neglected. And if we're really going to improve people's lives through data, we think that creating a learning culture is important for that. Next slide. So this was brought home to me by, we tried to do a teaching point in the Infuse Data Lab, where we say to people, do you think in your organization measurement is done for accountability or for learning? And we hoped everyone would say accountability, and then we could say, what about learning? And one of the associates really memorably said, in our local authority, we collect loads of data all the time, but as far as I can tell, no one's ever held accountable, and we never seem to learn anything. So, which I thought was a bit depressing, but also probably quite honest. Next slide. So I'll give you an example now on the learning conditions needed. If you know the answer to this, don't type in the chat, but if you don't know the answer, let's have a go at this. So this is a real example. Someone did an experiment. They got 4 similar groups of people. One group got the intervention. So there was an intervention, and in that group, no one died. And the other 3 groups didn't get the intervention. And across those 3 groups, 40% of people died. So the first question is, what was killing people and what was the intervention? So for example, you might say chemotherapy, like cancer was killing people and the intervention was effective chemotherapy. That'd be a really good guess. It'd be wrong, but it'd be a really good guess. So can you type in the chat what you think was killing people and what was the intervention? Road accidents, seatbelts is a great guess. It's wrong, but it's a great guess. Poison? No, not poison. So another good guess, for example, could be oral rehydration salts for diarrhea in children, for example. Lifeboats on ships, great, great guess. You're kind of halfway there, interestingly. That is a great guess. I'll see. I'll give Sarah, see if anyone else types a guess. So, if you go to the next slide, penicillin's a good guess. So James Lancaster took a fleet of 4 boats. One boat got daily lemon juice, and on that boat, no one died. The other 3 boats didn't get lemon juice, and 40% died of scurvy within 6 months. So scurvy is really caused by vitamin C deficiency. It's very nasty. It was a huge problem on long voyages. Huge numbers, like this example, 40% died of scurvy within 6 months, which is about how long it took to sail from the UK to South Africa at that time. And lemon juice packed full of vitamin C, and you can store it well. So the one boat got daily lemon juice, no one died. So the second question, how long do you think it took for lemon juice for sailors to become policy? So this is compelling evidence. You've got 4 boats, pretty much identical. You give daily lemon juice on one, no one dies. Like, this is compelling evidence. How long, if you type guesses in the chat, please, how long do you think it took for lemon juice for sailors to become policy? I think that might be where limey comes from, you know. I'm not sure. It's a good question. So someone says in the Navy, probably not much time at all, in local government, about 5 years. Aisha's guessed 150 years. It's quite a depressing guess. Yasmin, 3 years. If you go to the next slide, So Aisha's depressing guess of 150 years, maybe it wasn't a guess, maybe you know, is not even depressing enough. So James Lancaster submitted his report in 1601, and the British Navy acted almost 200 years later in 1795. So with huge loss of life over that time. So why was it so slow? Well, partly James Lancaster had no clear explanation of how it worked. At the time in 1601, no one knew what vitamins were. No one knew that scurvy was caused by vitamin deficiency. There was no real explanation of how it worked. He was well regarded within the Navy, but he wasn't prominent within naval medicine, so he was largely ignored. And other more prominent people in naval medicine proposed other solutions that had more traction for a long time. Next slide, please. So this invites us to think about who gets listened to in our organisation and who's finding it hard to be heard, but has really compelling evidence for us. So in terms of hints for creating a learning culture, we've got 3. The first is be clear when what you're doing is a learning project, not a doing project. So a doing project, it would be delivering statutory services and this kind of thing, where failure is a really bad thing. In a learning project, failure is a good thing. Failure is, as long as you understand why you failed, as long as the failure is in achieving rather than in learning, then it's all good. So you're trying to learn and failure tells you as much as success. As part of that, you've got to be openly fallible. So admit to your mistakes, tell people about mistakes you've made so that they understand that that's okay. And then also just be curious, like ask questions, show that it's okay to be curious. And in this work, we redrew on the work of Amy Edmondson, who's done amazing work on building psychologically safe workplaces. Next slide. So I also talk about data maturity, and I'll speed up a bit here. So many of you will know what data maturity is, but if you don't, it refers to how advanced an organization is in the way it manages and uses data. You could think of this as the data maturity of the organization can be more or can be less than the sum of the parts even. Next slide. So we saw 3 good examples of data maturity frameworks. One was Audit Wales did a great piece of work in 2018-2019, measuring data maturity across the 22 local authorities. The report's available. I'd be fascinated to see it repeated now post-COVID to see whether the changes that we think we see in data maturity are real or whether they're just surface level. So there's that one. Data Orchard have one that's really for the third sector, and Nesta have their Wise Council data maturity framework. So just to give you a sense, there's 5 categories: how you manage data, your governance and openness, how you use data, your data skills capability, and your data awareness and culture. And then you measure yourself on a 5-point scale. So we think that explicitly trying to improve your data maturity as an organization is a really worthwhile goal. Next slide. And so the last one is around using data with integrity. Next slide. So why is it important that public bodies use data with integrity? Well, we really tried to convey 2 things here. One was understanding the difference between data governance and data ethics. Data governance being can we, based on the law, and data ethics being should we, based on our values. So for example, if the Home Office decided that they want to electronically tag all asylum seekers and refugees in the UK so they know where they are at all points in time, there's a couple of questions there around the data. One is the governance question. So there's, can the Home Office do that? And there's a generally agreed upon answer that's based on an interpretation of the law. But there's in some ways more important question of should they do that? And that's based on your values. And even on this webinar today, we'll have a variety of opinions about whether they should do that probably. And you can see that's rerouting your values. So local authorities and other public bodies understandably are very hot on data governance, but we encourage people to think more about the ethics as well as the governance. And we think that if you do that and you involve communities, you can empower them and you can build trust. So one of my favorite examples of why this is so important, a colleague of mine tells a story of a true story of a local authority that was worried about citizens who were struggling to pay council tax. So everyone who was behind on their council tax, they wrote to them and said, look, we're here to help. If you're struggling to pay your council tax, get in touch and we can have a discussion about this. And some concerned citizen phoned the council switchboard and said, I'd like to report a terrible scam. And they said, what's the scam? And they said, someone has written to me pretending to be from the council saying they can help if I'm struggling with council tax. And the person on the switchboard said, well, what makes you think it's a scam? And the person replied, well, it's the council. Of course, they never offered to help me with anything. And so that story, I think, is it's one of those where you don't know where to laugh or cry, but it gives some sense of how many citizens are quite distrustful of their local government and other public bodies. So, sorry. So we think that by involving them and by thinking more about the data ethics and being open about that, we can help empower communities and build trust. Next slide. So to do that, we suggest using the Open Data Institute's Data Ethics Canvas. So this is a self-reflective tool. It won't tell you what to do, but it will help you think through what you should do or could do. So it's got a series of prompt questions in 15 different sections, as you can see here. And we found that, it takes an hour or two to go through it with your team. And we found that this can be really helpful prompt questions to really make sure you're covering all the bases and feel like you're covering the bases, feel like you probably cover most things you need to cover. Next slide. So that was just our 3 equally important messages about being data enabled, proactively creating the right conditions for data innovation, and the need to use data with integrity. So think about the ethics. Next slide. So just to finish off from me, and then I'll hand back to Owen. I invite you to think about what could you do next. So maybe you could commit to trying out one of the following. So asking about the outcomes first when people come to you with a data project, ask about the outcomes they're hoping to achieve, and you could suggest the data action story or the Lottie 6-step model for that. You could think about trying to create an environment that values learning more explicitly. You could start a discussion about improving data maturity in your organization. And you could ask if we should be doing this, not just can we do this, and you could try out the ODI Data Ethics Canvas. So that's all from me and from the Data Lab. So thanks very much. Please feel free to type any questions in the chat and I'll hand back to Owen now. And thanks for running the slides, Owen, much appreciated.
No problem. Thank you, James. Some really thought-provoking questions and prompts for us within that. I'd just like to finish off and perhaps, James, add to your questions or call to action at the end of the slide. As a programme, we are really keen to start some conversations today with people that are interested in not only data innovation, but other areas of innovation across public and third sector, maybe even private sector businesses that have kind of shared motivations or shared intrinsic drive to make a difference on some of those big, wicked societal challenges that I talked about earlier. The handbook, which as soon as I stop sharing these slides and we go to questions, I will drop into the chat function for you, but I will make sure that our slides and links go to Suzanne and the team at Data Cymru as well for dissemination. But what you can see on the screen in front of you are 4 of many innovation experiments that have been written up into case studies. I suppose you could call this the so what, and the real life application of some of the tools, the methods, the processes that James has just shared with you. It hopefully, for those of you certainly within public sector, will give some integrity to some of the points in which we've offered, because they have been applied. I think last slide is just to share Social platforms are all at Infuse 2023. If you would like to reach out for that conversation, infuse@monmouthshire.gov.uk. The handbook, I'll stop sharing slides so I can see the chat, and I will drop that in there. I suppose our ask to everyone, aside from the questions that James has just posed to you, the content in which James has just delivered, there is a section within that, simple but effective, I would call it, handbook. Please, could you share that with public, third, private sector colleagues? Could you think of someone who's should perhaps receive this in a direct message or an email this afternoon? It can and will help everyone facing change, facing uncertainty, and looking to innovate. And I suppose if you take the uncertainty bit around the financial position at the moment facing many public, third, and other organisations, I think it's never been a more important time for people to have this support. So that's us. Thank you very much, Suzanne, and genuinely appreciate everyone listening. I'll reiterate, hopefully this is a start of a conversation and you can now see what we're passionate about.
Excellent. Thank you both ever so much. And that is our first session where we've done interaction. So that was really good. Well done, James. I was very impressed. I've now got my little brain ticking around how we can do more of that, because I thought that was really good and worked really well. So thank you very much both. If we have no questions posed at the minute, but I'm sure that there will be. So if you do have questions, please do post them in the chat. I did have one at the start, but it was answered throughout the presentation, which is excellent. So I don't even have one up my sleeve ready to ask you, I'm afraid, but I'm sure that there will be questions come in. Although or people may just be reading handbook and we may not get anything now because everybody is reading the handbook, having a look at it. So just give it a minute or so. Oh, good question. Will Infuse run again? Oh, sorry, Owen, I didn't realise you had your hand up. Do you want to come in first before that question?
I will come in on that question, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Absolute mind reader in the chat there, no doubt. I was just going to offer while people were considering questions. So what I can tell you is the European social funding concluded at the end of September, but we're currently working with the Cardiff Capital Region to look at a slightly different model of delivery, and I think a model of delivery that embraces the current challenges that are facing public and third sector at the moment. So what you can expect from Infuse, and I'm hoping within the next 3 months we'll have developed this, we'll have secured continuation funding, and we will be able to provide a very clear picture, but you can expect it to be mission focused. So we had some real success in the last cohort, so cohort 3 on the programme, where we defined a genuine problem which will affect many different organisations and communities, and we recruited individuals to that. So the problem that we looked to tackle was attracting, recruiting and retaining great people in social care and health. So based on a decent amount of research, evidence and data from the front line and from leadership, we looked at that, and some examples, not-for-profit recruitment agencies being developed within the region, some policy changes. If you want to know any more about that, there's a case study on the website, shameless plug. But we are hoping that within the next 3 months, there will be a very clear offer, and I'm sure you can pick this up, but James, I and the rest of the team believe that public and third sector leaders, aspiring leaders, people on the front line deserve to be much better prepared than we are now, than I felt before this programme, for the multiple crises that we face, the kind of the diverse, complex increase in need, and that kind of burning platform that it can feel like you sit on as a public servant when public service spending is decreasing as well. So we're absolutely committed. Give me 3 months and I should be able to share with your network something very, very exciting.
Thanks, Owen. So almost a follow on, I guess, is this scope for this approach to be adopted? I don't know if that's the right word, but adopted by other regions, or for other regions to kind of, or other local authorities to be involved in this? I'm just wondering what the scope is for kind of building on this.
Great question with a simple answer, yes. Due to funding constraints, and any of those on the call that have had any time with European social funding and the constraints that come with it, bless you, because it's been a challenge. But we are absolutely committed to ensure that this is much more than just the Cardiff Capital Region. It's good, isn't it, to test something on a reasonable footprint, and to build relationships and trust. But yeah, we ran an event, Mindsets and Methods for Innovation in Public Services, on the 20th of September. And since then, we've had a lot of interest from other public bodies, other local authorities. It's also been applied, Suzanne, to some. So if I take an Iron Bevan, which works across the Health Board, which works across the Gwent footprint, they have taken the purpose and the principles of Infuse and kind of embedded it in a value-based healthcare approach. So again, cohort-based, looking at adoption of innovation and how we apply it. So we're very keen to kind of jump outside of our little Cardiff capital region box and look to work with others.
Okay, another question. What came out of the latest Infuse that has adjusted any future approach?
I suppose just to clarify, future approach to the programme or future approach to kind of local practice? I can chat to both, and perhaps James may want to also. But if I
there we go, let's do both.
I'll be candid. We set out as an Infuse programme to tackle some of society's biggest challenges. We found that when we invited individuals to the programme, our scope became far too wide quickly. Age-old problem that people brought their kind of biggest problems and challenges. We tried to theme them, we tried to bring them together. But as I set out from early on, collaboration around innovation is what we're set out to do. And this was a weakness. So you heard me talk earlier about a mission or a kind of problem-focused approach to innovation. We believe, from some research and some learning and from current interaction with senior leadership teams across public service at the moment, that attacking some of those big problems, but with a focused approach. So for previous cohorts, we will have worked on, well, you've seen kind of 10 or 15 different problems, far too much. We want to bring, like I said earlier, that collision space of expertise from all and areas that we can into one. I think if, whilst we're on a data call, I'll happily pass over to James, but what I can tell you is, when I look across the region, and I'm in a unique position to be able to dip in and out of different organizations, data action stories, approach to being data enabled, huge changes to the way that people are approaching problems before jumping to solutions. And there are measurable differences. There are some examples in the handbook which will bring this to life. But I would say data action story. I don't think I've met an associate that has mentioned that it hasn't made a difference to the way that they've approached their work practice, and often by the afternoon. So if James has delivered that in the morning, it's quick enough to be applied by the afternoon. That's what we wanted as public servants from academics like James.
And certainly in the internal and external evaluation, when you go back 6 months later and ask Infuse associates, what do you remember and what did you find useful from Infuse? One of the things they almost always say is they might call it the data story, or they might call it the data action bit or something, but essentially the data action story really, it really chimed with them, because I think they've seen too many data trawling exercises or seen too many data analysis projects that started without a clear endpoint in mind and got a bit like mired in the mud then, and found it hard to go forward. I think certainly through the cohorts, we kind of started with here's some tools that might be useful. And then we realized it's not just about the tools, it's about the mindsets and the how you try and challenge power in your organization and this kind of thing. And then as you continue, you realize the organization has to want to change. And Owen always has this nice analogy about if you take a withered plant out of poor soil and nurture it in really good compost till it becomes a strong plant and then put it back in the poor soil again, it's just going to end up withering again. And so there's that thing that the organizations need to change as well. And the reverse mentoring, I think, was really helpful for that. The reverse mentoring was so key there is a slight caveat, I suppose, which is that mentoring typically works well if you want to be mentored, and reverse mentoring typically works well if you want to be reverse mentored. But with that caveat, I think it really was quite transformative in terms of changing power dynamics and this kind of thing. Other projects will often have a sponsor. And then one of my favorite phrases for this, excuse my language, is someone says, one of my colleagues often says, you need a shit umbrella. And the shit umbrella is someone who'll put up the umbrella when all the stuff is raining down on you to keep you protected so you can keep doing the project while you need to do the project. So trying to make sure you've got a shit umbrella is always a good thing. And maybe on that note, I'll stop talking before Suzanne kicks me out.
Thank you very much. I'm trying not to laugh because of my throat, but that's fine. Are there any more questions? We've got a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, Ben was great. He came and delivered some material on Cohort Alpha and really inspired us with a lot of his work. Yeah, and
you've done quite a lot.
Yeah, and they've done lots of work with their data maturity framework now in the third sector. And if you go on the Data Orchard website, you can see they've got lots of graphics around what's being produced from it. It's really impressive work.
Well, it looks like we're out of questions. We'll keep an eye on it, but it is 2 minutes to 1 anyway, so we'll draw a line there. So all it remains for me is to thank you both very much for being with us today and imparting that knowledge. It was really, really great. We're already starting with the thumbs up. I love to see some thumbs up. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording and obviously thank you to everybody for attending as well. So thank you very much.